In Chapter 1, you learned about different subsets of real numbers. The set of real numbers is itself a subset of a larger set of numbers, the complex numbers. Curiously, the complex numbers include a number like a in the solvet. Its fifth power is itself. The complex numbers are based on a number whose square is -1. The imaginary unit, I, is the complex number whose square is -1. So I squared equals -1, and I equals the square root of -1. Take note, key concept, square root of a negative real number. Take note of the information here, but we'll see greater detail in the next few slides. In terms of algebra, we can state for any positive number a, the square root of -a equals I, the imaginary unit, times the square root of a. Note the information in the callout. The square root of -a can be rewritten as the square root of -1 times a. The square root of -1 times a can be rewritten as the square root of -1 times the square root of a. The square root of -1 is the imaginary unit, so it can be replaced with I, and this all simplifies to I times the square root of a. An example, the square root of -5 equals I times the square root of 5. Again, we see greater detail in a callout. The square root of -5 can be written as the square root of -1 times 5, which can be rewritten as the square root of -1 times the square root of 5. The square root of -1 is the imaginary unit, so it can be written as I, and this all simplifies to I times the square root of 5. Take note that the square root of -5, in parentheses squared, equals -5, not 5. Here's an explanation. The square root of -5 squared equals the square root of -1 times the square root of 5, in parentheses squared, which can be rewritten as, in parentheses, I times the square root of 5 squared. Distributing the exponent to the I and to the square root of 5, we have I squared times the square root of 5 squared. That's -1 times the square root of 5 squared, which is -1 times 5, which is -5. Problem 1. Simplifying a number using I. How do you write the square root of -18 by using the imaginary unit I? Well, the square root of -18 can be rewritten as the square root of -1 times 18, and then split into two factors, the square root of -1 times the square root of 18. That's I times the square root of 18. The square root of 18 simplifies to 3 times the square root of 2. So in its simplest form, we write 3i times the square root of 2. Your turn, part A. How do you write the number, the square root of -12, by using the imaginary unit I? Part B. How do you write the number, the square root of -25, by using the imaginary unit I? Part C. How about the square root of -7, using the imaginary unit I? And part D is a reasoning item. Explain why the square root of -64 does not equal the negative of the square root of 64.